In the dim light of early morning, the air inside Oak Ridge Shelter still carried the chill from the night before. The rows of metal kennels were silent, broken only occasionally by the soft scratch of claws or the weary sighs of beings waiting for something better. At the end of the corridor, in a small, seemingly forgotten corner, a large German shepherd curled up tightly, back pressed to the wall, head lowered, eyes avoiding every glance. They called him Maverick because no one knew his real name, no one knew his past. 3 days ago, Maverick had been found wandering along the highway shoulder. No collar, no microchip, just a staggered gait and drooping ears, like he'd long given up on kindness. When staff took him in, they noted clear signs of past abuse, flinching at sudden movements, trembling at raised voices, and most hauntingly, his eyes. Eyes that had seen too much cruelty, with no way to speak of it. A special note was attached to Maverick's intake file, written by Jenny Winters, a seasoned volunteer coordinator. Approach gently, no sudden movements, maintain a safe distance, give him time. It wasn't just a guideline, it was a plea, a silent call to anyone who might try. Please, give Maverick a chance to believe again. But that morning, Jenny was absent. She was homesick with a fever, and the shelter, as usual, was desperately understaffed. The task of cleaning the kennels fell to Marcus Davis, a newly hired employee just a few weeks in. He had no experience working with animals carrying emotional trauma. What Marcus brought with him that day was fatigue, the pressure of a heavy workload, and a growing impatience, the kind that often surfaces when empathy runs thin. "Up, now!" Marcus barked, irritation bleeding through his voice as he stood before Maverick's kennel. But the dog only shrank deeper into the corner, body tense. His dark brown eyes widened, not in defiance, but in fear. Marcus reached in to grab the loose part of the dog's collar, but Maverick flinched, letting out a soft, voiceless whine. And then, in a fleeting moment, it happened. A harsh, unrestrained slap struck Maverick's muzzle. The sound wasn't loud, but it was sharp enough to rattle the heart of anyone who still carried compassion. Maverick yelped, not just from the physical pain, but from the fresh sting against an already wounded soul. He crumpled into himself, trembling violently, his body pressed flat against the cold wall, his eyes clouding with panic. Marcus finished the rest of his chores in silence. He said nothing more, and never looked back. What he didn't realize was that the surveillance system had recorded everything, from the raised arm in anger to the anguished sound of a creature who'd already endured too much. Worse still, he forgot to lock the kennel door on his way out. That door, a small oversight, would become the start of something much bigger. The beginning of a journey for a dog once invisible, who would go on to shine light into the darkest corners of the system. But at that moment, inside that cold, iron kennel, there was only Maverick, curled in fear, mute from pain, unaware that his life was about to turn a page. The back door at the end of the hallway creaked open, letting a cold draft slip across the damp, dark concrete floor. Under the pale hum of fluorescent lights, the kennels retained their usual morning stillness, a quiet not of peace, but of something heavy left unspoken. Yet within that hush, something was missing. A presence, and the absence of it, made the air feel unsettled. Elena Rodriguez stepped inside with a canvas crossbody bag, a dark beanie slouched on her head, and eyes still touched by sleep but lit with her familiar sense of purpose. A third-year veterinary student, she had devoted most of her free time to the Oak Ridge Shelter, a place where she believed she was learning not just how to heal physical wounds, but how to understand life, fear, and bravery through creatures without voices. That morning she carried something special, soft, liver-scented treats that Maverick had responded to during their last encounter. She'd sat quietly outside his kennel for nearly 30 minutes. No touching, no pressure, just soft-spoken words and patient presence. Maverick hadn't approached, hadn't sniffed the treats, but she noticed that the fur around his neck flinched less every time she moved her hand. That small change was enough for Elena to promise herself she'd return as soon as possible. She passed each kennel slowly, smiling gently, whispering the names of the familiar animals. But when she reached the last corner, the one marked Maverick, special care required, what met her was a void. The kennel was empty. The metal gate is slightly ajar. Bedding crumpled. No leftover food. No signs of him being taken elsewhere. Elena froze. For a second, the air around her seemed to still completely, and the only thing she could hear was her heartbeat pounding faster in her chest. She crouched to inspect the lock. No signs of forced entry. No notices posted on the kennel door as required whenever an animal is moved. She turned and walked quickly to the front desk, where the intake logs were kept. In a voice clear and firm, she asked, "Has anyone moved the German Shepherd from the last kennel?" No real name. Temporary name is Maverick. The staffer behind the desk shook their head, frowning slightly. No one said anything. He's still listed under Kennel 36. "Elena," another volunteer called out, but she had already turned and was moving quickly down the hall, mind racing through possibilities. Maybe someone took Maverick for a bath or a medical check? Maybe his kennel was being repaired? But deep down, she knew. Animals like Maverick are never moved without strict protocols. It's a non-negotiable rule for trauma cases. At the start of the corridor, Elena's hand tightened around her bag strap. A decision formed instantly. She filed an urgent report with the acting coordinator, requesting a lockdown and internal search, while others began opening kennels and inspecting the exercise yards and supply sheds. Elena chose a different path. She didn't follow a map. She followed instinct. She imagined, if I were a creature who had been beaten, who lived in fear, afraid of loud sounds and sharp voices, where would I hide? Not the yard, not the main hallway, not the noisy feeding area. Somewhere quiet, enclosed, with familiar scents, fabric, antiseptic, the trace of old human presence. The back storage room behind the clinic, the one almost no one entered in the morning. She pushed the wooden door open slowly. The hinges groaned. She didn't turn on the light, didn't step in fast. She just knelt, opened the bag of liver treats, and whispered, "Maverick, it's me. Elena." No response. But in the far corner of the room, behind a stack of old blankets and disinfectant bins, there was a pocket of shadow where light couldn't reach, and something within it moved. Elena didn't approach. She sat down, back against the wall, placed the bag beside her, and pulled out her phone. No calls, no recordings. She opened her audiobook app, and in a whisper soft as the wind began. "There once was a little fox who lived deep in the forest. Every morning he watched the sunrise and wondered if anyone would see him today." Minutes passed. Then 10. Then 20. Elena didn't look up, didn't seek confirmation. But somewhere in that time, a faint shiver came from the back of the room, a breath, longer, gentler, and eyes, deep, brown, once full of fear, were now watching her, still hidden in the dark. The dog was still trembling, still unmoving, but he was listening. Maverick hadn't disappeared. He was trying to trust again, and Elena knew in that very moment that this was no longer a simple search. This was the beginning of healing, where patience, gentleness, and understanding would light the way for a wounded soul to find its way back to the world. Elena kept reading, each word falling into the air like slow, steady drops on a still lake. No one but her could have known that this seemingly ordinary moment was the beginning of a profoundly healing journey. In the shadowed corner of the supply room, where the light barely touched the dust-covered edge of an old blanket, a creature curled up tightly, trembling among worn fabrics as if trying to disappear entirely. Maverick didn't move. His body was so tense that even his breathing seemed labored. His dark eyes stayed fixed on Elena, not with the hopeful gaze of a typical dog, but with a watchful, restless look, heavy with fear. He didn't growl, didn't resist, didn't show any signs of aggression. But it was precisely this closed-off silence that was the most desperate cry of all. Maverick didn't want to be touched. He just wanted to be left alone. Elena understood. She didn't approach, didn't coax, didn't try to force friendliness. She simply sat there, legs folded, back leaning against the rough wooden wall, her voice as steady and gentle as if telling a story to a child just waking from a long nightmare. Each word was like mist, soft, delicate, and spoken with the kind of gentleness only someone who had touched the edge of another being's pain could offer. In the faint light, Elena quietly watched. Maverick's ears began to lift slightly with her cadence. The fur on his neck no longer bristled, and though he still trembled, the shaking slowed and softened. Perhaps he didn't trust her yet, but he was listening. That was the first step, and the hardest, in reaching a traumatized animal. Elena didn't hope for more. She didn't need him to come closer. It was enough that he hadn't run. Outside, the sound of footsteps and voices echoed through the frantic search. But inside the storage room, there were only two presences. One human choosing patience as her language, and one dog using silence as his shield. Elena gently opened the bag of soft treats, took out a small piece, and placed it on the floor a safe distance away, not close enough to breach Maverick's boundary. She didn't expect him to eat it. Sometimes, just the presence of food without pressure is enough to send a message. The world is not always a threat. Maverick stared at the treat for a long while but didn't move. His gaze was still full of caution. Whatever he had endured made every human gesture seem unpredictable and dangerous. Maybe it was a hand raised in anger. Maybe a leash was yanked too hard. Or maybe it was the long, silent days locked in a tiny space with no kind voice. These wounds didn't show clearly on his body, but they etched themselves deeply into his memory and reflexes. Maverick's body had learned to be alert as a means of survival. After nearly an hour of sitting together in silence, Elena noticed a very small change. When she shifted her legs to get more comfortable, Maverick didn't retreat like before. He just watched her, his eyes still wary but with less panic. He was measuring. He was slowly relearning the language of closeness on his terms. A little later, he adjusted his position, lowering his head onto his front paws, looking tired. Maybe he understood now that he wouldn't be dragged out, yelled at, or forced into anything. And in that safety, he dared to breathe a little easier, even allowed his eyes to flutter shut for a few moments. Perhaps for the first time in days, he felt safe enough to let go. Elena remained still, hands resting on her knees, eyes watching carefully, afraid even the slightest wrong movement might undo everything. But she knew, sometimes, the strongest action is doing nothing at all, letting a broken soul find its rhythm again. And if she was lucky, maybe one day Maverick would no longer need to hide in the dark. But for today, just staying in view was enough. A fragile sign that somewhere beneath all the fear, a small piece of trust still flickered. In that dim storage room, where the weak light barely reached the hard edges of old plastic bins, time seemed too slow to make space for something quietly blooming. Elena remained exactly where she was, back against the wall, knees slightly bent, hands resting gently, and her voice steady like a lullaby. Not for a child, but for a soul who had learned fear far too young. Maverick still lay half-buried under blankets, ears perked and alert, but no longer rigid with tension. Every time Elena paused to turn a page or shift her weight, he didn't startle like before. The change was so subtle it would have gone unnoticed by anyone not watching with total presence and patience. But to Elena, each micro-shift was a priceless sign. That trust, when sown right, could begin to take root even in the most barren places. No one had taught her how to do this. She'd learned during her internships, besides animals who no longer had the strength to resist, through quiet afternoons spent with creatures who'd never known the warmth of an embrace. She had come to understand that for a dog who had been abused, a non-invasive presence meant more than any comforting words ever could. And today, She brought all that quiet wisdom to sit beside Maverick, not to tame him, not to befriend him, but simply to let him know that someone was here and wouldn't cause him harm. Nearly an hour passed, and the room seemed to breathe slower too, as if it was learning from her calm. Then Maverick did something that made Elena's heart skip. He shifted slightly, just a few inches toward her, but enough to notice that his body was no longer pressed tightly to the wall. His front legs were tucked more comfortably beneath him. His chest no longer heaved with panic, and for a fleeting moment, his eyes met Elena's. Not a stare, more like a glance to confirm she was still there and still safe. Elena smiled softly. She didn't say a word. Her eyes lowered gently, sending a signal that she understood. She understood that for Maverick to make even that small movement, he'd had to overcome invisible barriers built from months of neglect and layers of scars that never healed. And she understood that even the briefest glance could be a reply, as if he were saying, "I'm still here. I'm still trying." A quiet knock on the door interrupted the moment. Elena turned her head calmly. The door opened slightly, and a middle-aged man entered with a tense expression. It was Tony Grayson, the shelter's director, a stern man who rarely involved himself in minor animal behavior issues. But today, he had to step in. "Elena?" he asked quietly. She nodded, signaling for silence, then pointed toward the blanket pile. Tony looked over, and for several seconds, his eyes widened with surprise. Maverick, the dog who always curled up in fear at the mere sight of a human, was lying still, watching Elena. He hadn't bolted, hadn't growled, hadn't buried himself deeper. It was the first time since Maverick's arrival that Tony had seen the dog not completely shut down. No touch had been exchanged, no steps had been taken, but the change was real, alive, and undeniable. "He came closer?" Tony asked, his voice lowered. "Not exactly," Elena replied, her eyes still on Maverick. "But he didn't leave. I think that's enough for today." Tony stepped back toward the door, his face tight with thoughts that hadn't yet formed into words. "I'm going to review the cameras. Something's not right," he murmured. The door closed. Elena remained seated, hands still in place. Maverick watched the door for a moment, his gaze dropping slightly as if to confirm that the threat had gone. Then he turned back toward Elena. The motion was quiet as air, but it gripped her chest. Not from fear, but from the emotion of it. From knowing that connection was being spun from the smallest, most fragile threads. She didn't try to get closer, she just kept reading. And Maverick, though he didn't move forward, didn't retreat either. Somewhere deep inside him, a crack had opened, just enough to let light in. And if someone was patient enough not to rush past that light, maybe, just maybe, Maverick would one day step fully into it. When Tony stepped out of the storage room, the door closing behind him felt like a barrier between two worlds, one where patience was slowly soothing wounds, and one where tension was thickening under suspicion. He hadn't said it aloud, but he knew a dog as deeply traumatized as Maverick wouldn't have escaped his kennel, wandered off, and hidden in a closed room without something pushing him, or scaring him, into doing so. Tony headed straight for the monitoring room, where the shelter's surveillance footage was securely stored. With the technician's help, he queued up the recordings from earlier that morning, before Elena had arrived. He wasn't one to jump to conclusions, but after seeing the raw fear in Maverick's eyes, he needed something concrete. As the footage played, the screen displayed the familiar image of a metal kennel. Maverick, huddled in the corner, head low. A figure in a gray uniform approached, the large build and hurried steps unmistakable. Tony clenched his jaw when he saw the name tag peek out from the shirt. Marcus Davis. Nothing seemed unusual at first. Marcus stepped up and impatiently opened the kennel. He had a broom and a small bucket in his hand. He said something, but there was no audio. Based on his mouth, he was issuing a command. Maverick didn't move, staying frozen in the corner, eyes wide with unease. Marcus frowned. He took a step forward, reaching to grab the dog's collar. Maverick recoiled, body pressing tighter to the wall. And then, Tony froze. A swift, sharp motion. Marcus's arm swung, hand landing hard on Maverick's muzzle. There was no sound, but Tony didn't need to hear it. The violence was clear. Maverick jolted, his head jerking sideways, ears flat, whole body shivering. The moment only lasted seconds, but the footage hit Tony like a blow. He had seen negligence before, but rarely such blatant cruelty, especially in a place meant to be a final refuge for the broken. Marcus finished cleaning quickly, never checking on Maverick. When he left, the kennel door was left ajar, the latch hanging loosely. Minutes passed, and Maverick lay frozen. Then, slowly, he rose, inching toward the door. He nudged it. It opened. What followed was a silent, heartbreaking sequence. A dog walking cautiously down an empty hall, head low, as if afraid of his footsteps. No one saw. No one stopped him. He disappeared into the supply room and out of sight. Tony said nothing when the footage ended, but he knew this couldn't be buried. He asked the technician to review previous weeks. Any time Marcus had worked alone in the dog section. The findings made Tony's heart sink. Maverick wasn't the only one. 3 other videos showed Marcus shouting, yanking, and even kicking kennels when dogs barked. One small dog was backed into a corner, shaking. An old dog flinched from yelling, eyes wide with terror. There was no sound, but the images were damning. Once the truth is revealed, it can't return to innocence. It's torn, bruised, and leaves a bitter taste in the mouths of those who once believed that this shelter, though old and overburdened, was still a safe place. Tony stood silently in the control room. He no longer looked at the screen. He was thinking of Maverick's eyes. Not angry, not wild, just a cold, wounded stillness. He knew from that moment on, no one could pretend they didn't know. No one could blame stress or exhaustion for what had been recorded. Marcus hadn't just struck a dog. He had shattered the fragile trust that shelters were built upon. Tony walked away, fingers gripping the USB drive. He knew he owed it not just to Maverick, but to every animal who had suffered in silence behind those bars. And if the beginning had to be brutal truth, then at least it would also be the start of something better. When Tony stepped out of the surveillance room with the USB drive in his pocket, something in the air outside had changed. The familiar walls of Oak Ridge Shelter now carried a strange new weight, as if the silent bricks, after all these years, could no longer hold back what had been buried inside. Each footstep Tony took across the concrete floor felt heavier, burdened by a responsibility that had just awakened with the uncovering of truth. But he knew this wasn't all of it. News of the footage spread internally within hours. Longtime volunteers whispered among themselves, wary glances exchanged in passing during cleanup rounds. Staff who had shared shifts with Marcus started recalling small details they had once brushed aside. Signs that, pieced together, might have pointed to something far more sinister. And in the middle of this slow unraveling, an elderly woman knocked on the administration office door. Her steps slow, but her eyes steady with resolve. Her name was Evelyn McCulloch, a resident of the small cottage just behind the shelter's back fence, only a few steps from the property line. Locals called her Miss Evelyn Who Feeds the Dogs because every evening she brought a small bag of homemade biscuits and stood outside the fence, calling each dog by names she had invented. The dogs barked at the sight of her, not from fear, but with a kind of expectant joy. Tony knew her. Not well, but enough to exchange polite nods in the parking lot. But today, Evelyn wasn't there to hand out treats. She had come for something far more serious. "I don't want to cause trouble," she said, her voice slow but certain. "But I've seen things that shouldn't happen, and I don't think I can stay quiet anymore." She reached into her embroidered cloth bag and pulled out an old, scratched phone. Stored in its limited memory was a short video, just over a minute, filmed from the second-floor window of her house, which overlooked part of the shelter's rear yard. The beginning showed nothing unusual. a man leading a cream-colored dog into the yard. But a few seconds in, the scene changed. Marcus, no doubt about it. The silver-gray uniform, the tall build, the backward baseball cap. He was trying to pull the dog forward, but the animal, likely elderly or tired, refused to move. Marcus bent down, muttered something through gritted teeth, and then suddenly drove his knee hard into the dog's side. The dog collapsed slightly, whimpering. Still, Marcus continued dragging it like a piece of lifeless furniture. Evelyn had filmed the whole thing from her living room window on a quiet autumn afternoon. At first, I told myself he was just tired, maybe under pressure, she said, eyes fixed on Tony. But after I heard about that German shepherd yesterday, I can't pretend it was just an accident anymore. She handed Tony the phone. I know I'm just an old lady behind a fence, but I also know what pain looks like. Tony took the phone with both hands. He didn't immediately press play. He didn't need to. He knew that the truth didn't lie in a single clip. It lived in the pattern. This video, combined with the internal surveillance footage, made one thing clear. This wasn't a one-off incident. It was a pattern, a repeated behavior. And if one dog had been hurt, there were likely others still unaccounted for. Back in the surveillance room, Tony asked the tech team to extract additional footage, not just from the main cameras, but from lesser-used ones rarely reviewed. That night, he watched hours of overlooked recordings, a puppy being shouted at until it urinated from fear. A curly-haired dog was lifted off the ground by a taut leash, choking silently. In every clip, Marcus's face appeared, expression cold, eyes blank, never remorseful. Tony called Jenny, the volunteer coordinator, even though he knew she was still homesick. When she answered, her voice raspy from illness, he said just one sentence. "We have a problem. I need you back." Jenny didn't ask questions. She understood. If Tony was calling in person, it meant things had passed the point of negligence. Her heart sank, not just because of Marcus, but because of the creeping suspicion that the wounds she'd seen on certain animals weren't accidents, weren't fear-related. They were warnings no one had truly heard. Perhaps over the past weeks, the whimpers in the dark had been cries for help misread by everyone. And like a river swelling after the first heavy rains of the season, more truths began to rise, pulled from the deep, quiet places in the system. Places where silence and routine had served as perfect cover for quiet harm. But this time, something had shifted. Someone had spoken up. An old woman behind a fence, a vet student who chose to stay instead of walk away, and a dog, trembling and broken, who pointed to the truth simply by existing. Tony's message came just as the sky turned dark. Though her throat still burned and a light fever clung to her body, Jenny Winters, Oak Ridge Shelter's longtime volunteer coordinator, grabbed her coat and left her house without asking for more details. She had been with this place long enough to understand. When Tony said, "I need you to come back," it wasn't just a work request. It was a warning, one that meant something deeper, something serious. By the time Jenny arrived, Elena was still sitting quietly beside Maverick in the dimly lit storage room. The lights had been lowered to a gentle glow so as not to startle him. Maverick, or at least the name they were using for now, was no longer buried in the pile of old blankets. He still didn't approach, but neither did he shy away from the human gaze. His deep brown eyes tracked movement, not with panic, but with focused awareness. Jenny recognized it instantly. This wasn't how abused dogs usually looked. She had seen too many cases to miss the nuance. There was something familiar in that stare. Elena gently rose to give Jenny space, not to replace her, but to offer a short rest. Jenny didn't sit down right away. Instead, she pulled out her tablet and opened the intake file she had created on Maverick's first day. The photos were clear. Pale fur around the eyes, a dark streak running from the neck to the left shoulder, and a patch of missing fur on the right side of his belly, suspected to be stress-related. But now, staring at the dog in front of her, Jenny noticed a contradiction. The fur around his eyes wasn't the same. It was darker, more even in tone. And the streak along his side wasn't just fur. There was a faint, crescent-shaped scar, nearly healed but still visible beneath the short coat. Jenny frowned. That scar hadn't been in the report. She would never have missed something like that. She held the tablet out to Elena and pointed at the image. "Do you see what I see?" Elena looked carefully, then slowly nodded. "The scar. I thought it might be recent, maybe from the abuse, but it's older. And his eyes. They're not like a dog who was just rescued. They're like a dog who's been trained." Jenny didn't answer right away. She just exhaled softly and opened another folder on the tablet, a private archive of special cases from the shelter. One of them was labeled, "Duke, missing last month." When she tapped it open, the air in the room grew heavier. Duke, a former K-9 assigned to the county's narcotics task force, had been reported missing during a routine training session in the Western Forest area. The official story claimed he may have been attacked by wildlife after becoming separated from his team. His body was never recovered, but Jenny still remembered the look in Officer Jason Reeves' eyes when he returned to the shelter weeks later, unconvinced, unwilling to believe Duke had simply vanished. And now, in the soft glow of the storage room, the dog everyone had been calling Maverick lay quietly on the old blankets. Jenny didn't need long to compare. The build, the stance, the eyes, and most telling of all, the small scar along his right side matched perfectly with the Duke she remembered. "No way," Jenny whispered. "This is Duke." Elena looked up, shock spreading across her face. "But how didn't anyone notice when he was first brought in? Didn't he have a chip?" "It might have been removed," Jenny said grimly. "Or maybe it migrated. But if someone wanted him to disappear, this wasn't an accident." They looked at each other in silence. In front of them, Duke's deep brown eyes shifted slightly to the right, as if he too understood something important had just been uncovered. Elena leaned closer, her voice a whisper soft as wind. "Welcome home, Duke." In that old storage room, beneath a dim light, a truth had just been revealed. Not just the identity of one dog, but the first sign that behind the thin veil of metal kennels and intake paperwork, something deeper and darker had been waiting to be exposed. Elena's soft words still lingered in the air like a thin breeze. "Welcome home, Duke." And in that moment, it seemed even Maverick, or rather Duke, froze, as if he was listening not with his ears, but with the deepest corners of his memory. Jenny sat silently beside him, eyes fixed on the tablet screen displaying an old photo of Duke, head lifted beside his handler, a man in a police uniform, one hand resting gently on the dog's shoulder like a fellow soldier. Not a pet. His name was Jason Reeves. Neither Jenny nor Elena said it aloud, but both knew. Only one person could confirm this. Not through images or data, but with a single word. Only one person could call Duke's name and have him rise, not from fear, but because he recognized he was being called home. Jenny dialed the number. Her fingers trembled. Not from fever, but from the feeling of touching something delicate, suspended between loss and hope. The line rang 3 times before a weary, hoarse voice answered. "Reeves speaking." "Jason," Jenny said quietly, her voice lowered to a whisper that carried weight. "I think we've found Duke." Silence, not the kind caused by poor reception. A silence heavy with memory, longing and pain, tangled into something that words couldn't reach. Then Jason asked, barely above a whisper, "What did you say?" "He was brought into the shelter 3 days ago under the name Maverick. No chip, no clear history, just his eyes and a scar that matches exactly. I'm sitting with him now. Elena Rodriguez is here too. And Jason I wouldn't call unless I was sure. There was no need for more." The call ended less than a minute later. Just over 30 minutes after that, the roar of an engine echoed past the front of Oak Ridge Shelter. A black SUV screeched to a halt in front of the lot, without bothering to find a space. A man in a dark leather jacket moved quickly through the gate, as if his soul, not his body, was leading the way. Jason Reeves had arrived. The storage room door opened, and in the dim light, the man froze when he saw Duke lying in the far corner. No one spoke. Jenny and Elena silently stepped back, giving space for two beings who were once partners. And Duke had heard. He slowly lifted his head, dazed at first. Then his ears perked up, and his chest lowered to the floor in a slow, cautious motion, as if exhaling something long held in. His eyes widened, and in that moment the look on his face was no longer that of a wounded animal, but of a soldier recognizing his commander after believing he'd been abandoned forever. "Duke!" Jason called, voice catching. "It's me, buddy, it's me!" The sound of boots echoed softly on concrete as Jason knelt, hands not reaching just yet. He looked at Duke with eyes that had once trained him, once fought beside him, once stayed up all night to protect others. There was no begging, no pressure, only an invitation to come home. And Duke, after a few hesitant seconds, stood up. He no longer trembled. He no longer avoided eye contact. He walked forward, steps still cautious but without fear. When he reached Jason, he didn't jump, bark, or whimper. He simply placed his head between Jason's knees and exhaled deeply, as if the weight of the world had just been lifted from his shoulders. Jason bowed his head, arms cradling Duke's head in a slow, reverent gesture, as though afraid to wake something sacred. He didn't cry out loud, but his tears fell onto the thick fur at the base of Duke's neck, the same spot he used to pat after every grueling training session. The room was completely silent. Elena and Jenny dared not move. The usual shelter noise seemed to fade outside the walls, giving way to a reunion so profound that even time paused. Duke let out a low, quiet sound, not of pain, but of a soul finding its anchor in the storm. Jason buried his face in the dog's neck, whispering over and over, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I didn't find you sooner." This was no longer a moment between a police officer and a service dog. It was the reunion of two souls that had survived together, been torn apart by indifferent hands, and found their way back to each other through something no language could name, except perhaps unshakable, pure friendship. As Jason held Duke tightly in his arms, no one in the room dared disturb the silence that had been rebuilt by the dog's breathing. A warm, steady rhythm, as if he was allowing himself to breathe fully for the first time after a long captivity. But despite the emotion, Jenny knew that hugs weren't enough. They needed to know what Duke had endured. A few hours after the reunion, Duke was taken to the shelter's in-house veterinary clinic, a small but well-equipped space where many animals had been evaluated after escaping abuse. Dr. Mira Santos, a behavioral specialist and longtime collaborator with Oak Ridge Shelter, arrived earlier than usual after hearing about the case. Duke entered with Jason by his side. He didn't flinch at the bright lights or the low hum of the machines. He showed no resistance when asked to lie on the exam table, but he never took his eyes off Jason, not for a second, as if making sure this wasn't another trap he'd have to face alone. Mira began with the basics: weight, temperature, and heart rate. His intake form listed him at 80 pounds, average for a K9, but the scale now reads under 65. His shoulder and hip bones were starting to protrude under his dense fur. His belly was sunken. Clear signs of prolonged malnutrition. The hind leg muscles showed mild atrophy, common in animals who have been confined without movement. "He didn't run away," Mira concluded, voice firm. "A K9 like Duke doesn't just bolt and stay in a state of constant stress. This body shows signs of confinement, isolation, not wandering." When she scanned for a microchip, nothing registered. Not surprising, but she checked manually along the neck and shoulders. Then she paused. On Duke's left shoulder, beneath sparse, regrown fur, her fingers traced a small, crescent-shaped scar, about 2 centimeters long, freshly healed. "Here," Mira whispered. "A surgical incision." She gently shaved the area and disinfected it. The suture had been done with dissolvable stitches. No infection. Skillfully executed. This wasn't from trauma. This was a deliberate surgical removal. Jason's fists clenched. He stood beside Duke, jaw tight, eyes fixed on the scar as if memorizing every detail. There was no longer any doubt. Duke hadn't gotten lost. Duke had been taken, systematically, intentionally. Someone had carefully removed his only form of identification, then kept him hidden until he was unrecognizable to the system. "There's one more thing," Mira said gently. "Duke still responds quickly to basic commands, but when I used 'leave it' or 'stay', his anxiety spiked, especially when I brought out a leash." He trembled slightly. "That kind of response points to being tied or restrained for extended periods, long enough that even basic commands now trigger fear." The room went still. Jason moved closer and gently touched Duke's neck. His hand slid down to the shoulder and rested on the scar. Duke didn't flinch. He only let out a deep, exhausted breath, as if saying all that he couldn't. "They didn't want anyone to know who you were," Jason said, voice low. "They didn't want you to be found, and they never thought you'd survive long enough to come home." Mira nodded silently. Everyone in the room understood. This wasn't a case of a lost dog found. This was an abduction, a targeted disappearance of a trained K9, for reasons still unknown, but not innocent. Duke hadn't gone missing. He'd been erased, stripped of his identity, thrown into the system under a false name, as if he'd never belonged to anyone. The truth had been written across his frail body and in his once shaking eyes. There was no denying it now. Duke was living evidence, not only of what had been done to him, but of something deeper, wider, more systemic that had slipped under the radar of an unsuspecting community. And from that moment on, no one could look away anymore. From the moment the surgical scar was confirmed and Duke's true identity revealed, the atmosphere at Oak Ridge Shelter changed entirely. It was no longer just an animal rescue center. It had become the heart of a story much larger, a search for truth, where every detail might uncover part of a carefully hidden chain. And Duke, the dog once curled behind a pile of blankets, had now become a silent yet undeniable witness in what could escalate to a federal case. Jason didn't wait until morning to act. That very night, he filed an urgent report with the city police department and contacted his former commander from the K9 unit. Training records, ID photos, descriptions of Duke's specialized skill set, all were compiled within hours. Soon after, the case was escalated to federal investigators, because when a high-level police K9 is abducted, stripped of its ID microchip, and confined in a manner designed to erase its identity, it's no longer a local issue. The FBI officially opened an investigation. Early the next morning, a team of plainclothes agents arrived at Oak Ridge Shelter. No sirens, no media vans, just firm steps, sharp eyes, and the quiet intensity of professionals trained to unearth what others had buried. Jenny, Jason, and Elena were called into the administrative office to assist with the initial debrief. And it was in that first meeting that vague details began forming a clearer picture. Duke had been a highly trained K9, specifically conditioned to detect synthetic compounds in a new drug wave sweeping through the Midwest. Before his disappearance, he and Jason had participated in at least 4 drug bust operations, with near-perfect detection rates. In several instances, Duke had picked up scents even human teams missed, locating hidden caches in improbable places. "He was a living barrier between drug traffickers and their freedom," Jason said in his statement. And they knew that. The FBI theorized that Duke may have been kidnapped by a criminal group to remove him as a threat, or even retrain him for illegal use. The fact that he was later found abandoned near a highway, without a chip but still alive and not visibly tortured, suggested a change of plan. Either Duke had escaped on his own, or the abductors had dumped him when keeping him became too risky. Marcus Davis, the shelter worker caught on camera striking Duke and leaving the kennel unlocked, was immediately suspended and brought in for questioning. Pressed with the surveillance footage and Evelyn's prior video evidence, Marcus could no longer deny the abuse. But what caught the agent's attention wasn't just the slap. It was the inconsistency in his story about how Duke came into the shelter. "You say someone dropped the dog off early that morning?" an agent asked. "Yes. A middle-aged man left him at the gate and drove off." "Any camera footage?" "I think the cameras were down that day. But when the FBI reviewed surveillance data, they found blurry footage from 2 nights prior, clearly showing Marcus and an unidentified man sneaking a blanket-wrapped dog into the back area of the shelter. No official intake, no transfer forms, and no manager's approval. Even more suspicious, Marcus himself had created the file for Maverick and marked it as stray found near the highway. No chip located. This wasn't an accident, the agent concluded. This was system bypassing. With mounting evidence, the FBI expanded the investigation into Marcus's financial records and personal contacts and began cross-referencing missing canines across the state. Duke might just be one piece of a much larger puzzle, where highly trained dogs became targets in a network using rescue shelters as a front for criminal repurposing. At Oak Ridge Shelter, Duke continued recovering, both physically and emotionally. Though he wasn't yet ready to return to duty, he had started responding to familiar voices, especially Elena's gentle afternoon readings. Jason stayed close, watching for every subtle sign. No one spoke of the case in front of Duke. They didn't want to add anxiety to a soul already tired from surviving. But they knew. This time, Duke was no longer a silent victim. He was the key, and behind those once fractured eyes, a story was waiting to be told. Not through barking or words, but through truth, justice, and the belief that even if you've been hidden, the light can still find you. As the investigation reached a critical point, with systems being audited, records examined, and staff interviewed, life inside Oak Ridge Shelter carried on in a quieter rhythm. In a peaceful corner far from the noise, Duke continued healing in his way. He no longer flinched when people approached, but remained cautious, especially at night. Sudden sounds, creaking doors, humming vents, a car braking too sharply, could still startle him into trembling, even crouching low to the floor, a survival reflex etched into his memory. There were only 2 people with whom Duke allowed himself to fully relax. One was Elena, the vet student with the sunrise soft eyes, the first to sit silently with him in the storage room. The other, surprisingly, was Noah Carter, a quiet 11-year-old boy with autism who lived nearby and often came with his mother to feed stray cats through the shelter fence. The first time Duke saw Noah, the boy didn't rush over like most children. He didn't reach out to pet him, didn't exclaim how pretty he was, didn't ask his name. He simply stood a few meters away, hands folded in front of him, gaze fixed hesitantly on Duke's paws. Duke didn't react either. He glanced once, then lay back down. But unlike with other strangers, he didn't retreat. He didn't show stress. He just existed, Elena noticed. And from that day forward, she gently arranged for Noah to visit at the same time each afternoon, not to force interaction, but to let 2 sensitive beings share space on their own terms. Soon, something unspoken began to form. When Noah sat on the ground, back to Duke, piecing together small wooden blocks he carried everywhere, Duke would slowly draw closer, not eagerly, not intrusively, but always stopping just close enough to observe. Sometimes he would lie down behind Noah, eyes half closed, ears alert to the soft clinks of the blocks, as if that repetitive rhythm brought him a calm no one else could offer. Then one stormy night, thunder cracked over Oak Ridge. Rain slashed across the roof. Lightning lit up the windows in fits of white. Many animals panicked, and Duke was no exception. Despite Jason's presence and Elena's calming voice, he curled into a corner, trembling uncontrollably, wide-eyed, and darting glances across the room as if haunted by ghosts only he could see. Elena had never seen him like that. This wasn't mere fear of noise. This was memory. Somewhere in the wind and strobe of lights, Duke was reliving the night he'd been taken. Perhaps it had rained that night, too. Perhaps darkness reminded him of cages, leashes, and isolation. Even the gentlest human voice couldn't reach him. While Jason and Elena discussed mild sedation, Noah arrived. The rain still fell. The boy said nothing. He stood at the doorway, looking at Duke, who now cowered in a tight ball, panting hard. His mother waited by the gate, umbrella in hand, face tight with worry. But Noah had insisted on coming. Somehow he had known Duke needed him. Elena nodded gently, permitting him. Noah stepped inside, removed his hoodie and folded it neatly. He sat on the ground, placed the hoodie a few feet from Duke, then turned his back to him and began arranging his wooden blocks, his ritual. And then something incredible happened. Duke lifted his head, not toward Elena, not toward Jason, but toward that small, silent figure. His ears perked, his breathing slowed, and then he crawled forward, low to the ground but steady. He reached for the hoodie and lowered his head onto it as if seeking out its warmth. Noah didn't turn around, but he reached back slowly and rested his hand on Duke's head, soft, unpressured, just a gentle touch, as if to say, "I'm scared too." And somehow, that was the touch that reached Duke where no voice could, the one that pulled him back from the edge. Jason stood frozen. Elena covered her mouth. Jenny, watching from the doorway, wiped away a tear, unsure whether it came from awe or the painful beauty of seeing one soul mend another without a single word. From that day on, Noah became a quiet fixture in Duke's recovery. No schedule, no need for permission. He just showed up, sat close, and built his shapes. Duke lay beside him. No conversation, no spotlight, just silence, connection, and the softest, most powerful kind of bridge back to the world. Since Duke began healing, thanks in part to the quiet, unspoken connection he'd formed with Noah, Elena and Jenny found themselves more determined than ever. While Jason focused on Duke's psychological recovery, the two women began a task no one had asked of them, but that both knew was necessary. They started reviewing every intake record from the past 3 months at Oak Ridge Shelter. It wasn't baseless suspicion, not after everything they had witnessed, from Marcus secretly bringing Duke in under pretenses, to the eerie way his behavior and training contradicted the sparse information in the Maverick file. Something wasn't right beneath those seemingly ordinary records. That afternoon, Elena sat in front of a computer in the coordinator's office, the screen light reflecting on her increasingly tense face. She combed through digital files, focusing on entries processed by Marcus or overnight staff. Meanwhile, Jenny combed through physical paperwork stored in the cramped archive behind the main office, flipping each page with a meticulous, questioning gaze. And then, the patterns started to emerge. "Jenny," Elena called softly, voice edged with alarm. "Look at this intake file, dated the 18th of last month, a dog named Rex, labeled as a shepherd mix with a docked tail, supposedly due to an accident. But check the behavior notes. Reacts to prolonged whistle tones, lies down on visual hand signal." Jenny frowned, leaning over. Her eyes locked on the behavioral note. Hand signals? Defensive reactions to whistle sounds? These weren't the instincts of a typical stray dog. These were trained responses, military or law enforcement level. They kept digging. Within 2 hours, Elena had uncovered 5 intake records with similar anomalies. Dogs listed as strays with no known history, but whose behavior revealed precise training. One responded to "back" by pivoting, and another dropped instantly at the word "down" from meters away. Some flinched at the distinct sound of military boots on tile floors, a detail too specific to ignore. In the archive room, Jenny paused at a slim file labeled "Bolt," processed by Marcus just a month prior, showing a minor injury to a rear leg. Nothing seemed notable, until a faded margin note caught her eye. It had been erased, but faint writing still lingered. "Responds to German verbal commands." "German," Jenny whispered. "No way." Elena looked up. "What did you say?" "German commands, Elena. Only Legacy K9 units trained under international standards use them. No local shelters teach that. Not anywhere near here." There was no doubt now. These records had been deliberately falsified. Not just ID information, but behavior logs as well, to mask the fact that these weren't random strays. They were professionally trained dogs, inserted into the system with new names, no chips, no traceable pasts. A shadow network had begun to take shape. Do you remember the case of the 3 missing canines from Pine Ridge County last year? Elena pulled up the archived news. Within minutes, images and descriptions of the dogs appeared. Each vanished mysteriously during or after missions. No signs of struggle, never recovered. One of them, Canine Thor, was born with a docked tail. She flipped back to Rex's file. Tail docked due to accident. The room fell silent. Jenny didn't hesitate. She picked up her phone and called the FBI's temporary office in town. "We've identified more potentially compromised dogs," she said. "Some may be missing canines. Intake records appear deliberately falsified. Potential identity erasure." The voice on the other end didn't ask questions, just said, "I'm on my way." Outside the window, dusk fell fast. The shelter's rows of kennels flicked on with warm, yellow light. Dogs lay silently under the glow, eyes watching the quiet yard. But beneath that calm, something had awakened. Not in the barking, not in the clinking chains, but in corrupted data, erased notes, and the silent memories of dogs whose names were never called again. And Duke, the dog who had his identity stripped, was now the key that unlocked it all. Falsified records, behavior notes that didn't match, dogs forgotten in the shadows of a flawed system. All had formed a disquieting picture that left Elena and Jenny restless. But the reason Duke had been targeted, the thing that made him valuable enough to be abducted and stripped of identity, remained unclear. That answer, as if waiting patiently for the right moment, arrived through something deceptively simple: the scent in Elena's backpack. That morning the sky was clear and soft. Duke was taken to the rehab yard behind the shelter, an open space where Jason had carefully arranged basic objects to help rebuild the dog's confidence. No high fences, no leashes, just soft grass, a few training posts, and the ambient sounds of birds and wind. Duke was still adjusting to large, open movement. He walked slowly, often glancing back at Jason, as if only his partner's presence permitted him to enter the world again. Jason kept his distance, never pushing, never rushing, just as he had trained Duke in the beginning, when he was a black-furred pup with wobbly ears and boundless energy. Elena placed her usual backpack near the bench at the field's edge, a heavy, well-used vet student's pack stuffed with books and papers. She didn't think twice. But Duke stopped. Jason noticed instantly. Duke's ears twitched. His body froze, tension radiating like a taut wire. He turned toward the bag and walked toward it, not cautiously, but with focused intensity. Jason recognized the shift immediately. Duke was detecting something. The dog sniffed around the backpack, nose close to the zipper. Then he froze again, let out a low, rumbling growl, not aggressive, but a warning, a signal, the kind trained dogs give when they've found something critical. Elena blinked. "What?" "It's just books and notes." She unzipped the pack and began pulling things out. Textbooks and binders. When she reached her pharmacology textbook, thick, glossy, and often printed with scent samples for student exercises. Duke stepped back slightly. His ears stood straight. He turned to Jason, awaiting instruction. Jason moved to his side, laid a calming hand on Duke's shoulder, and then picked up the book. He flipped it open to Elena's current study section, an entry on semi-synthetic alkaloid compounds with known neurochemical effects. A folded scent test paper remained tucked inside the back cover. The smell was faint, but Jason's face changed. Duke had reacted to this scent the same way he had during operations, the way he did when detecting synthetic stimulants tied to the drug labs they once pursued. Jason went still. "He's reacting just like he did on missions," he murmured, "which means he still remembers, and if he remembers, then maybe." He didn't finish, but the dots started connecting. The night of the disappearance. The absence of physical struggle. The unexplained removal of his chip. And now, this. Duke had smelled this compound somewhere, before he vanished. And it might have been that very reaction that marked him for capture. Elena's breath caught. Her eyes widened with realization. You think he was taken because he could detect this? Jason nodded, jaw tightening. If Duke was one of the few K9s able to detect the base compound used in newer synthetic drugs, the kind black market labs are just starting to adopt, then to those labs, he's a threat, a direct one. No one spoke. No need for lab reports. No need for analysis. Duke had said it with the one thing that couldn't be faked. His instinct. Pure. Undiluted. And now it all made sense. Duke hadn't been discarded. He had been hunted. Jason stood, eyes on Duke, now calmly sitting beside Elena, as if confirming what they all knew deep down. He placed a firm hand on the dog's back, voice steady as a promise. We'll find the people who touched you, Duke. We'll learn why and for who. After the pivotal rehab session where Duke reacted intensely to the scent sample in Elena's pharmacology book, Jason had no doubt left. He had seen that look in Duke's eyes before, the alert, tense focus that only appeared when he sensed danger. But this time, it hadn't happened during a raid. It happened on a quiet patch of grass, and that alone chilled Jason to the bone. The very next morning, Jason requested a forensic team from the FBI to re-examine all physical traces left from the day Duke was brought into the shelter, especially the soil and dust embedded in his paw pads, claws, and belly fur. Although Duke had been bathed during intake, Jason knew from experience that K9s always carry the subtlest clues of where they've been, sometimes in a single, unnoticed speck of earth. The samples were sent to the lab that day. The results didn't surprise Jason, but they silenced the entire investigative team as the findings came in. Traces of methylamine, toluene, and hydrochloric acid, 3 common ingredients in synthetic drug manufacturing, were found in the soil under Duke's claws. But more telling was the mineral composition of the clay itself. A distinctive red soil rich in iron oxide, specific to a narrow stretch of land southwest of town. That area once housed an old chemical storage warehouse, abandoned nearly a decade ago. Jason tightened his grip on the report. You were held there, he said softly, eyes drifting toward Duke, who now lay calmly beside Elena, head resting on her leg. And it's probably there you smelled what scared them enough to try to erase you. By that afternoon, the FBI had sealed off the warehouse. Rusting gates, collapsed fencing, walls decayed over time. But inside, the story was different. In the back room, once a chemical test chamber, they found crescent-shaped scratches on the concrete floor, unmistakably from a dog's claws scraping repeatedly over time. A moldy gray blanket remained in one corner, neatly folded but damp. A dented metal bowl sat nearby, coated with dried residue. A 3-meter chain lay twisted over a cracked pipe overhead. Elena entered behind Jason. She said nothing. She laid a hand gently on the old iron door, where Duke had once been locked away. She didn't have to imagine the rest. Duke's reaction said everything. He froze at the threshold, ears up, nose twitching. Jason thought he might bark or growl, but Duke only walked slowly to the blanket, sniffed once, and then lay down in that exact spot, letting out a deep, exhausted breath. Elena, Jason said, voice no longer that of an investigator, but of an old friend. He remembers everything, and Elena understood. Duke didn't return because he liked it there. He returned because memory never left. Every rusty pipe, every scent in the air, every damp shadow was a shard of trauma stored deep in his being. But that same memory, that strange red earth, had become the breadcrumb trail leading Duke back into the light. When the FBI explored the warehouse basement, they found more. Recently used chemical containers, a still-running industrial fan, and an old security camera. Condition unknown. But everything confirmed one thing. This place was not abandoned. Someone had used it, perhaps to manufacture drugs, or perhaps to test Duke, to determine if he was the threat his profile suggested. Jason stood still for a long time in that room. He closed his eyes, feeling the steady breath of Duke beside him. "We found it, partner," he whispered. "Now it's Justice's turn." As Duke exited the warehouse with slow, deliberate steps, his eyes lingered on a shadowy corner of the room, the line between survival and oblivion. No one spoke. They didn't have to. The truth was unraveling, layer by layer, not through accusations, but through traces too clear to deny, and through the silent memory of a dog who had once been stripped of everything. That very evening, FBI forensics retrieved the hard drive from the basement surveillance camera, dusty and webbed with spider silk, thought to be defunct. However, several short clips had survived before the data was overwritten. One of them confirmed everything. On screen, the footage flickered, shaky but legible. Marcus Davis appeared at the warehouse entrance in a gray, protective suit. He wasn't alone. Beside him stood a tall man with his head covered, wearing a surgical mask and black gloves. Together, they pulled from the trunk of a dark SUV a dog wrapped tightly in a blanket, barely moving, possibly sedated. Elena gasped. "That's Duke," she whispered. "The way his shoulders tense. That's him!" Jason sat frozen, eyes fixed on the masked man. Something in the posture, the scanning gaze. It wasn't just the walk of a handler. It was the presence of a decision-maker. The clip lasted less than 2 minutes, but it was enough. Marcus hadn't acted alone, and Duke wasn't a stray rescued off the road. He had been delivered to Oak Ridge Shelter under a planned, disguised operation. The FBI widened its scope. Under a new warrant, they seized Marcus's personal phone, tablet, and GPS logs from his car. Within a day, forensic techs recovered a chain of deleted messages. Though no names or dog IDs were mentioned directly, the language was telling. "Chips out. Moving to second shelter if this one doesn't hold. Keep it quiet. Wait for a signal from K. This K became the new primary lead. Meanwhile, an analysis of Marcus's travel patterns revealed frequent nighttime visits to small, remote shelters. Many of them reported mysterious intake dogs. No images, no chip, no real histories. As investigators dug deeper, the similarities grew eerie. Dogs with command responses, fear of sirens, anxiety near combat boot footsteps, classic signs of former service animals. A hidden network was forming, not just of stolen dogs, but of stolen identities, where purpose-trained animals were erased, renamed, and possibly repurposed for illegal activity. And Duke, by fate or by force, had become the thread that unraveled it all. Jason clenched his fists. He looked down at Duke, now curled up beside Elena, head on her foot like a child finally resting after a long fever. But in his eyes, there was no defeat, only awakening. Only a silent vow. "I'm still here. I didn't break. And I won't let this happen again." Elena turned to Jason, voice steady. "If Duke can help expose this ring, we owe it to him to protect him. Physically, emotionally, as a being with dignity." And Jason, though a trained officer, nodded, not as law enforcement, but as a man who owed a friend the whole truth. Because the masked man beside Marcus was only the beginning. Jason knew that beneath that mask lay ties, possibly to the government, to veterinary systems, even to agencies that once promised to defend animals to the end. And so, the door that had first opened with a slap in a cage now stood wide, leading them into a conspiracy darker than anyone had dared to imagine. The conspiracy behind Duke's disappearance was beginning to unravel, each clue connecting to paint a picture of a system corrupted by greed, one that preyed upon the most loyal of creatures. But as truth began its slow crawl into the light, those hiding in the shadows began to push back, desperate to stop the wheels of justice. And the first target of their retaliation wasn't the FBI, nor the police. It was Elena. the young veterinary student who had once sat quietly beside Duke in a storage room full of tattered blankets. One weekday afternoon, while she was organizing care records for newly rescued dogs from an illegal breeding operation, Elena received an urgent notice. An anonymous complaint had been filed with the State Veterinary Regulatory Board, accusing her of fabricating psychological and medical data to manipulate a federal investigation, constituting professional misconduct. The news swept through Oak Ridge Shelter like a cold gust. Jenny dropped a file on the desk, eyes wide in disbelief. Jason, upon hearing it, fell silent for a brief moment before stepping outside to make a phone call, his grip on the phone so tight his knuckles turned white. As for Elena, thrust into a fight she never sought, she simply walked out of the office and headed straight to Duke's room. He lay there, eyes half closed in the golden afternoon light, tail thumping gently as she approached. Elena sat beside him without a word, placing her hand on his head, fingers weaving through the thick fur at his neck. "I don't know who's trying to silence us, Duke," she whispered, "but if you still trust me, I'll stand my ground." The internal hearing was held within the week in the county's modest courthouse. No cameras, no press. But every gaze in the room carried a tension that said, this wasn't just about a complaint. It was a trial by fire in a much larger story. Elena sat to the right, beside her attorney, assigned from the FBI's legal team since the case had gone federal. Opposite her was the State Veterinary Board's representative, a stern man known for his disdain of uncredentialed individuals acting beyond their scope in specialized environments. He began his questioning swiftly. "You are not a licensed veterinarian, correct? Then on what grounds did you diagnose Duke with post-traumatic stress behaviors? Who authorized you to store medical notes, images, and videos from within the shelter? Did you or did you not alter Duke's intake file?" Elena answered without hesitation. Her voice wasn't defiant, but calm, steady with the kind of empathy that only someone who has sat beside a wordless soul could speak from. She acknowledged her status as an intern, but she also provided her handwritten notes, dated and co-signed by Jenny, Oak Ridge's official volunteer coordinator. Included was the original intake report, where Jenny had recorded severe distress, adverse reactions to loud voices, and flinching from fast hand movements near the head. The FBI's legal counsel presented a key piece of evidence, footage from the shelter's security camera, showing the first day Elena found Duke in the storage room. The video showed Duke curled up in blankets, wide-eyed and shaking, slowly lowering his head to the ground as Elena read softly in the dim light. When the clip ended, the room fell into silence. There was no need for dramatics. The simple, still image had spoken louder than any rebuttal. Elena's attorney ended their defense with one question. Are we judging Elena for acting without a license, or for acting when no one else did? For saving a life and helping expose a federal criminal operation that others overlooked? The hearing officer lowered his eyes to the files. No rebuttal came. That same afternoon, the case was dismissed. Elena was permitted to continue supporting the investigation and caring for Duke in an official capacity, as a field specialist under supervision. It was more than a personal victory. It was an acknowledgement of her indispensable role in this unfolding story. Jason met her in the parking lot after the hearing. No high fives, no speeches, just the soft sound of a car door opening, revealing Duke lying calmly in the back seat. He lifted his head at the sight of her, sat up, reached through the open frame to gently lick her hand. Elena choked back a breath. "He knows," Jason said quietly. "He knows you stood up for what was right, and he's still here because you didn't back down." In the fading sunset, the Duke's coat shimmered in gold. The past no longer blanketed him like a burden. It now formed the bedrock from which truth would rise, solid, unshaken, and proud. Though Elena had been cleared and the accusations put to rest, peace did not return to Oak Ridge Shelter. Everyone knew. The deeper they dug into the conspiracy, the more dangerous it became. Somewhere in the shadows, people were watching. And as the truth surfaced, there were always those who would try to bury it again. That night, strong winds blew through the shelter's surrounding trees. Elena was on night duty, as usual, spending her final hour reviewing behavior reports for dogs rescued in a recent raid. At the far end of the corridor, Duke rested in the quiet room that had been his haven since his identity was confirmed. No kennel, no restraints, just a soft mat, a warm light, and a door always left ajar. He needed no locking, and no one dared deny him the right to choose where he stood. Near midnight, while Elena was writing, a strange sound came from the hall near the surveillance room. It wasn't wind or routine creaks. It was sharper, intentional, as though a lock had just been turned and a door carefully opened. She put down her pen, rose silently, and at that very moment, Duke's howl shattered the quiet. Not a mournful cry, not a growl of warning. It was a deep, commanding sound, the alarm call he had been trained to give when facing real, imminent danger. It was the alert of a sentinel. Jason, resting at his home only 2 blocks away, bolted upright as his phone lit up with an emergency alert from the shelter's internal system. He grabbed nothing but his gun and flashlight. He reached the shelter in under 3 minutes. Meanwhile, Elena called the police and rushed down the hallway. At the west corner, she saw the faint flicker of a flashlight, and a masked figure crouched at the security box, removing the shelter's hard drive. Gloved hands, swift movements. This wasn't a petty thief. This was someone who knew exactly what to take and how. But he had forgotten one thing. At Oak Ridge, not all the sentries were electronic. Duke emerged before the man could unplug the final cable. He didn't bark, didn't snarl, just stood still at the corridor's edge, muscles coiled, eyes gleaming gold in the dark. His presence alone was enough. The man froze, hands trembling. He turned to run. Too late. Sirens screamed from the parking lot. Jason arrived with 2 officers, flanking the escape path at the rear of the facility. Duke moved in formation, no commands needed, his training as sharp as ever. The intruder was identified as Vincent Cale, a former tech at the shelter, thought to have moved away. But his communications showed ties to Marcus Davis. Worse, they linked him directly to a shadow network trafficking stolen K9S, stripped of their past and resold. The drive Vincent had tried to destroy contained camera footage tied to Marcus's illegal dog intakes. Jason looked at Duke, then at Elena. Still gripping her notebook, no longer afraid, her resolve hardened by fire. "He didn't just warn us," Jason said softly. "He protected us." That night, Oak Ridge Shelter's security was elevated to its highest level. But everyone knew. When systems failed, Duke remained the most loyal, unshakable guardian of truth. He was no longer just a victim in recovery. He was the one standing watch against every shadow that still dared approach. After the night, Duke alerted the entire system with his warning howl when Vincent Cale, a former henchman of Marcus, was caught right in the dark hallway as he tried to destroy a hard drive. A new current was unleashed in the investigation. No one spoke then, but in the eyes of Jason, Elena, and everyone present, there was a silent, shared belief. Some truths could no longer be hidden. The FBI redirected all its manpower to processing the data recovered from the hard drive Vincent had tried to destroy. And from those files, seemingly ordinary internal records, they traced a chain of small shelters scattered across 3 states. These shelters shared a suspiciously similar intake method for nameless dogs, bypassing standard microchip checks. The intake logs were strangely uniform, brief descriptions, no accompanying images, and often signed off late at night or during unsupervised shifts. But one small detail had been overlooked, until Jenny, obsessed with spreadsheets and duty rosters, spotted it. "At all these shelters," she said, pointing to the wall map covered with red pins and thread, "the abnormal intake shifts all have one thing in common: the same final sign-off." The name appeared: Edwin Barris. deputy director of the state veterinary department, responsible for approving temporary licenses for shelters during upgrades or staff rotations. His name, which had often appeared as a routine authorization, now turned out to be the key to a hidden pipeline. Not just a signatory, but the linchpin allowing shelters to admit undocumented dogs without microchip verification. The FBI immediately expanded the investigation. While retrieving data from Barris's local server and official emails, they uncovered evidence of suspicious financial transactions disguised as emergency repair funds or federal rescue dog transport costs. But the most telling discovery was a requisition form for outdated microchip readers, devices incapable of detecting modern chips used in service and military dogs. Jason read the report in silence, his hand tightening around a long, cold cup of coffee. For a moment, everything returned to that morning, when Duke arrived at the shelter as Maverick, without a chip, without documents, and with eyes full of fear toward any approaching hand. Only when all the pieces came together did Jason realize that Duke wasn't a system error. He was the product of a system being exploited. In a closed-door meeting with the FBI, USDA officials, and several federal agencies, Barris's file was presented. A map appeared on the screen, marking 9 rescue shelters across 3 states, all showing signs of having received stolen working dogs. 4 of them had been issued special licenses by Barris, 2 of which had refused microchip scans earlier that year, citing identification system replacement. At this point, the story was no longer about Marcus or petty criminals like Vincent. It had reached the decision-makers, those who stood behind the veil of legality to legitimize disguised operations, those who permitted trained, loyal animals to be stripped of their names and pasts. And Duke, once again, reflected it all. Elena, who had meticulously recorded the behavior of every rescued dog, sat in silence in front of a newly arranged row of kennels. A new shepherd, just transferred from a shut-down shelter in the neighboring state, lay curled in a corner. He didn't growl. He didn't howl. He was just heartbreakingly quiet, unresponsive even when Elena called gently or placed food right in front of him. But when Duke entered the room, not loud, not forced, and lay down next to him, separated by only a wire fence, the shepherd's eyes flickered. A cautious glance, but something shifted. As if, in Duke's presence, he realized he wasn't alone. Jason watched from behind. He said nothing, just exhaled slowly. "Duke's teaching us something," he told Elena. "Justice doesn't only come from courts. It comes from not looking away when a wounded soul needs to be seen." And for the first time in weeks, Elena felt that in the swelling undercurrent, they weren't alone. Under the soft, fading sunlight of late autumn, as the investigations continued, and the list of shelters involved in the working dog trafficking ring grew longer, the Oak Ridge community decided to do something, small but heartfelt, to honor the creature who had started it all, a tribute to Duke, the silent guardian who awakened an entire system. Oak Ridge High School's field, once used for canine demonstrations, became the site of the healing ceremony. Simple wooden chairs were arranged neatly around a patch of grass. A banner bearing the Duke's image hung behind the stage, with a modest inscription below, "From victim to guide, Duke, a faith reborn." Duke did not walk the stage alone. He moved slowly beside Jason. No leash, no commands, just steps taken in silent understanding. He no longer trembled as he once did. His black coat had regained its sheen, and his eyes, once silent windows of pain, now held a steady light, as if he understood he was here not just for himself, but for all those voiceless beings who still could not speak. When the mayor presented the special honor, a small silver medal attached to a deep blue collar, Duke did not bark, did not wag eagerly. He stood still, gently tilting his head toward Jason as if to say, "With your gaze, the world feels safe enough to trust again." After the ceremony, as the crowd began to disperse, a young reporter approached Jason with a familiar question. Will you return Duke to the K9 unit? He seems ready for duty again." Jason looked at Duke, now resting beside Elena under a maple tree, breathing calmly, his body relaxed in rare peace. Jason was silent for a few seconds, then shook his head. "No," he replied, his voice soft but firm. "Duke gave us a second chance. Now it's our turn to do the same for other dogs." The following week, Jason and Elena officially announced their project. Duke's Haven Recovery Center, located on the very grounds of the abandoned warehouse where Duke had once been held captive. Now reborn for the opposite purpose, the building had been transformed into a place of healing. Spacious kennels with natural light, psychological therapy rooms, open play areas, and private rooms for dogs needing long-term quiet. Duke's Haven wasn't a typical shelter. It didn't aim for quick adoptions. It was a place for deeply traumatized dogs to rebuild trust, to live days unburdened by past shadows. Here, Duke would be a companion. Not a symbol, but a being who understood the language of pain that humans often could not reach. Elena, now acting as the center's temporary veterinary lead, stood beside Jason on the first day the sign was hung. Both remained silent as they watched Duke step into the main play yard, where he gently coaxed a severely depressed Labrador out of his corner for his first tentative steps into the light. "He doesn't need to return to the K9 unit," Elena whispered, "because he's found his team." And Jason, the man who once considered Duke a battle comrade during the most dangerous raids, felt for the first time that their mission hadn't ended. It had only just begun. No more sirens, no more radio commands. Now, the only language was gentleness, patience, and trust, rebuilt from broken pieces. Because not every animal gets a chance like Duke, to be seen, rescued, and healed. And that's exactly why Duke chose to stay, to do it for those who couldn't speak for themselves. Following the ceremony and the announcement of Duke's Haven, a quiet sense of new beginnings spread throughout the Oak Ridge community. But for those truly living inside the center, the dogs carrying darkness in their hearts, that journey didn't begin with flowers or applause. It began with silence, with eyes too afraid to look directly at anything, with each breath seeming to ask the world, "Is it safe this time?" In a small room behind the special recovery ward, Tinker, a tiny terrier weighing less than 8 pounds, curled himself into an old blanket. Rescued from a dog-fighting ring recently dismantled by federal forces, he was one of the few survivors. His ears were stitched, his tail amputated near the base, and his nails worn down from scratching cement floors. But his deepest wounds were invisible. Tinker made no sound, not even when vaccinated or held. Elena wrote a brief intake note. Signs of emotional paralysis. Likely suffered starvation and isolation in a violent environment. He wouldn't eat if someone was in the room. Wouldn't make eye contact. And when brought into the recovery area, he only retreated to the corner, turned his face to the wall, and responded to nothing. Every attempt to soothe him failed, until Duke was brought in. No procedures, no commands. Just on that Wednesday morning, after Tinker's therapy session showed no progress, Jason brought Duke to stand in front of the recovery room door. No one knew what would happen, but Jason, Elena, and even Jenny all understood something clearly. Duke had something beyond instinct. He entered the room without a collar, without a leash, his gaze calm, his gait soft, each step measured like a prolonged breath of patience. Duke didn't look at Tinker right away. He walked to a corner of the rug, lay down, and turned his back to the small dog. His whole body lowered to avoid pressure, his tail gently twitching in a slow, steady rhythm on the wooden floor. No sound, no confrontational gaze, just presence. Elena watched quietly through the surveillance camera. For the first 15 minutes, nothing happened. Tinker remained still, eyes open, ears folded, body rigid. But by minute 20, something subtle occurred, so small it could be missed. Tinker's ears twitched. A few minutes later, his gaze left the wall. He looked toward Duke, not with curiosity, but with something almost investigative, as if wondering, why isn't that large animal attacking? Why isn't it making threatening noises? Duke stayed still, his chest rising and falling like autumn air. At minute 33, Tinker shifted. Not much, just enough for his nose to touch the edge of the blanket. Elena cried when she saw it. Not because Tinker had done something big, but because it was the first time he didn't retreat. The next morning, the routine repeated. Duke lay in the corner again, shifting only slightly. This time Tinker took 2 steps. By day 3, he lay in the center of the room, less than a meter from Duke. And after 1 week, something no one dared hope for happened. Tinker approached Duke, gently licked his paw, then backed away, tail wagging, faintly but unmistakably. Jason, standing beside Elena in the control room, was visibly moved. He wasn't trained for this, he murmured, eyes fixed on the screen. Elena nodded, whispering, "He doesn't need to be. He understands." After 15 days, Tinker began to eat when Duke was in the room. After 3 weeks, he barked for the first time, a small, hoarse sound, as if his throat was unfamiliar with making noise. And after a month, when led into the central play yard, Tinker ran, for the first time, ears perked, legs stretching like a creature who remembered he was alive. Duke didn't run with him. He walked behind, watching quietly, pausing now and then so Tinker could glance back, like a teacher who didn't push, only remained present at the right time. In the monthly program report, Jenny wrote, "We don't have a standard protocol for this. But with Duke, perhaps all that's needed is for him to simply be there, living honestly." And Elena, updating Tinker's recovery file, struck out the line, "severe emotional disorder," and replaced it with, "recovery not following conventional model, but trust has begun to grow from the simplest thing, unconditional patience." Duke, once caged, erased, stripped of identity, was now bringing another life back into the world. Not through training, just by being present, by the scar on his shoulder, by the eyes once shattered but never extinguished. And from that day on, no one at the center called Duke a rehabilitated service dog anymore. They called him something simpler, something sacred, the teacher. Tinker's miraculous recovery wasn't just proof of the power of gentleness. It also sparked a deeply practical question among those who witnessed it. If Duke could do this for one severely traumatized dog, could he do the same? Not just in recovery centers, but where trauma most needed to be heard. In courtrooms? The idea was first floated during an internal meeting at Duke's Haven. Elena shared notes on how Duke had a calming effect during the rehabilitation of abused dogs. Jason, after reading the passage describing Tinker's first steps out of his corner, sat in deep thought for a long time. Then he said quietly, "We protect animals who've been abused, but when they're brought to court, they're just treated as lifeless evidence. If Duke can make them feel safe in the clinic, maybe he can do the same on the witness stand." It wasn't a simple idea. No state precedent existed for a dog to appear in court not as a seized asset or piece of evidence, but as a therapeutic companion for the 4-legged victims themselves. But everything Duke had done, from detecting Vincent that night to helping Tinker heal, had already made legal and behavioral experts question the old frameworks. 1 month later, with support from Elena, Jenny, and a team of animal law consultants, Duke was officially certified with a special designation, Oak Ridge State's first legal trauma canine support partner. It wasn't just a title. It was a formal acknowledgement that animals' emotions also deserved protection, through space, empathy, and safety, even in the cold atmosphere of a courtroom. The first trial using this model was the prosecution of an illegal dogfighting ring. Several rescued dogs were still recovering at Duke's Haven. By court order, 3 of them were brought in as living witnesses, not to testify, but to allow veterinarians and behavior experts to present their responses as evidence of psychological trauma. Duke entered the courtroom an hour early to acclimate. No leash, no muzzle, just a calm demeanor, gentle eyes, and quiet steps. He lay down quietly near the witness stand, making no sound. When Charlie, a pit bull and sole survivor of the ring's final fight, was brought in, he instantly showed signs of distress. Rapid breathing, curled legs, darting eyes. No one gave Duke a command. But he stood, walked slowly toward Charlie, and lay down a few paces away, turning his head slightly, avoiding direct eye contact. The room fell silent. No one expected that this dog, once a victim himself, once trembling in the dark, would now help another stand firm amid a courtroom of scrutiny. After a few minutes, Charlie lowered his body and lay down. No howling, no panic. He pressed his nose softly to the floor near where Duke lay and let out a faint whimper, the first sound he'd made since his rescue. The judge, once opposed to allowing animals in the courtroom, watched the scene, then nodded. "Therapeutic presence granted," he declared, "and I recommend this model be considered for similar animal abuse cases." Local media lit up, but for Jason, Elena, and the team at Duke's Haven, it wasn't a media victory. It was the first official recognition of a seemingly invisible value. The power to heal doesn't lie in speaking, it lies in presence. Duke didn't need praise. He only needed to be there, lying beside trembling creatures, letting them know they were not alone. Elena wrote in her nursing journal that day, "Duke didn't just emerge from his darkness, he lit a path for lives still lost in theirs." And somewhere in that courtroom, full of rules and procedures, Duke, with his silent eyes and heart once broken, had redefined justice, not just punishment, but healing. Duke's calm presence in that historic courtroom didn't just silence the room in shared empathy. It opened a new chapter in how humans perceive pain and the potential for recovery in animals. Immediately after the trial, police departments, veterinary centers, rescue organizations, and canine training schools across Oak Ridge State began requesting to study the legal therapy model using rehabilitated dogs. That was when the quiet dream Jason had long harbored was finally sown into action. A place not just for temporary shelter, but a center for training, recovery, and inspiration, built on Duke's very journey. With the support of the community, government grants, and private donations, Duke's Dignity Center officially broke ground on a once-abandoned plot of land behind Simwell Mountain. The area had previously served as a temporary holding zone for dogs seized in animal abuse cases. Now, this once barren land was redesigned as an open sanctuary, where natural light could touch every kennel row, where trees lined walkways, and where every structure wasn't made to confine, but to invite. On opening day, Duke stood beside Jason, his therapy vest neatly fastened to his chest. Though now 8 years old, the fur around his muzzle tinged with gray, he still held his posture strong, his gaze steady, just as it had been the first time he walked into a recovery room with Tinker. But today, he did not walk alone. Following behind him were 5 dogs once rehabilitated at the center, each carrying its own story, each bearing its scar, and together they were living proof that recovery is real when trust is placed in the right hands. Duke's Dignity Center was not just a sanctuary, it was a school for both sides. Here, former K9 dogs retired due to psychological trauma would be retrained in a low-pressure environment, paired with fellow recovered dogs as companions. At the same time, the center offered specialized training courses for handlers, police officers, shelter workers, and veterinary students, all based on a model co-developed by Elena and Jason, centered around companion therapy and nonverbal communication. Duke was integrated into the curriculum not just as an image in a case study, but as a living presence during psychological recovery simulations. He never did too much, but the way he approached a trembling dog, stopping at just the right distance, lying down at just the right moment, and waiting with absolute patience, that alone was a lesson no textbook could teach. In one simulation class, a final-year veterinary student once asked Elena, "How do we know whether to leave a recovering dog alone or to approach it. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she gestured for Duke to enter the small room where a newly admitted dog was curled against the wall, facing away. Duke walked in, unhurried, unforced, just present. 10 minutes later, the dog turned its head on its own. Elena smiled. Sometimes, the answer is to let a soul who once knew the dark teach us how to open the door from the inside. The program also expanded to train retired working dogs for new roles as community support animals. Rather than being quietly discharged and sent away, these once-serving dogs were taught to use their instincts more gently, to accompany children with autism, support courtroom procedures, work in recovery centers or elder care homes. And Duke, with his quiet composure, became the model. Not because he was the best, but because he had walked through brokenness to stand tall again, because he had once been erased. And now he was the name that opened a new chapter. During her speech at the center's opening ceremony, Jenny said, "Duke never demanded respect. He lived in a way that made us reflect on ourselves. And sometimes, the bravest thing isn't moving forward, but turning back to bring the lost ones home." That evening, as the guests had gone home, the lights in the play yard dimmed and a quiet shimmer of night settled between the newly planted trees. Duke sat quietly by the large therapy room window, his gaze resting on the view outside. Jason stepped up beside him and placed a hand on his head. He said nothing. He didn't need to, because everything was already there, in that sitting posture, trust, renewal, and the simplest truth of all, that sometimes the brightest light is born from a soul once left behind in the dark. As the first green sprouts began to emerge on the once scarred soil of Duke's Dignity Center, Duke's journey quietly reached beyond the borders of Oak Ridge. No longer the trembling dog in the storage room. No longer the eyes that flinched at every reaching hand. Now he stood as a living testament to a simple truth the world had long forgotten. Working dogs are not just tools for human use. They are sentient beings, capable of feeling pain, bearing trauma, and recovering from it. That truth brought Elena, now a certified veterinarian with a specialization in animal behavior rehabilitation, to a place she had once never dared to dream of. The International Conference on Working Animal Welfare, held in Berlin, gathering experts from over 30 countries around the world. In a closed seminar where new models were being introduced, Elena stepped up to the podium with no complex scientific charts and no dazzling data slides. She simply opened a screen and played a video, a clip of Duke lying beside Tinker, the first time the small dog dared to stretch a trembling paw off the mat. No one spoke when the clip ended, because it needed no explanation. Elena stepped to the microphone, her voice calm but firm. Duke was once a police dog. He was stolen, de-chipped, and locked away. He used to shake when anyone approached, but today he is the first legal therapy dog in my state, helping other dogs overcome psychological trauma. And this is what I want the world to recognize. We cannot speak of justice for humans while ignoring the justice owed to those creatures who stood beside us in silence. Over the next 45 minutes, Elena shared not just about Duke, but about the Tinkers, the Charlies, and the nameless dogs abandoned after fights, labeled as evidence, judged only by their ability to serve. She detailed the companion therapy model initiated through Duke, the principles of designing trauma-informed recovery spaces, and advances in retraining dogs post-trauma, now officially recognized by 3 leading veterinary organizations in North America. At the end of her talk, Elena showed a photo. Duke lying under the sunset in the grass yard at Dignity Center, his head resting against the leg of a young girl hugging a blind dog rescued from a landfill. Below the image was a quote from Duke's first recovery file. He didn't need commands or training, he just needed to be present at the right moment. When Elena stepped down, the room erupted into applause. A French expert, who had previously dismissed the idea of dogs having a right to recover as overly sentimental, approached and shook her hand. You didn't just present a case study, you opened a new way of thinking for the entire field. 2 months after the conference, the International Working Animal Protection Alliance announced a new ethical framework, introducing, for the first time, the concept of the right to psychological recovery for animals after service. In the appendix, the Duke's Dignity Center model was cited as a benchmark for reintegration and rehabilitation of working or psychologically injured dogs. Most notably, the nonverbal companion therapy program, using rehabilitated dogs like Duke as peer guides, was listed as a model to be studied, expanded, and trialed globally. Soon after, the Oak Ridge Center began welcoming international interns. Many had never met Duke before, but upon entering the recovery yard and seeing him, his calm posture, his observant, gentle gaze, they instantly understood why this once-stolen dog had become a symbol. Jason, during a conversation with a visiting trainer group from Japan, shared, "Duke never told us what he went through, but the way he looks at another creature's wound, we know he understands. And that kind of understanding, no language can match." Duke, the once nameless dog, misidentified as Maverick, who once cowered behind blankets as the world turned its back, had become both the full stop on a story of pain and the ellipsis to 100 more stories of healing yet to unfold. No one remembered him for being beaten. They remembered him because he stood up and taught the world to be gentler with those who cannot speak. When the first international policy recognizing the right to recovery for working dogs was signed, Duke's name appeared solemnly in the opening section as a symbol. But in Oak Ridge, where the morning sun still poured over the grassy steps of the Dignity Center, Duke never let himself become a still monument. 2 years since the center officially opened, he still rose early each day, still walked the familiar hallways, still nudged his nose against every water bowl, every kennel door, as if he understood that the heart of this place didn't lie in certifications, but in the frightened eyes waiting to be led into the light. Duke was now 9. The fur around his neck had turned salt and pepper, his gait had slowed, and sometimes he needed a rest midway through the day. But if you watched closely, you'd see that his eyes, once mirrors of panic, now quietly lit up each time a new dog arrived. It was no longer a reaction, but a silent promise. "I've been where you are, and if I could walk out of it, so can you." That afternoon, as sunlight slanted through the reddening maple trees, a new dog arrived at the center. His name was Bram, a young shepherd not yet a year old, once trained for search and rescue work, but pulled from the program due to prolonged anxiety. People said Bram disliked light, refused to go outside, and panicked at the sound of sirens. His ears were always folded down, and he'd turn to face the wall whenever someone unfamiliar approached. Elena, now both the head veterinarian and therapy director of the center, didn't issue a command. She simply said to Jason, "Let Duke meet him for a bit." And as he had so many times before, Duke stood up slowly, gave himself a little shake as if brushing off the dust of sunlight, and made his way toward Bram. He didn't approach right away. He walked only to the training yard door and sat down, tilting his head to look at Bram, who was curled in the shadows at the end of the hall. After a moment, Duke looked back, then stood up and took 2 more steps, stopped, looked back again. Elena smiled. He doesn't lead, he invites. It took nearly 15 minutes for Bram to take that first step out of the dark corner. Each step was hesitant, each heartbeat pounding. But Duke stayed, neither moving closer nor walking away, just being there, like a quiet boundary of safety, like a small flame lighting the path for a soul learning to return to itself. Eventually, Bram touched the grass. The amber sunset poured over Duke's steady figure, bathing the yard in soft, golden light. And in that moment, when 2 dogs, one old and one young, stood together at the threshold of trauma and healing, something extraordinary happened without a single word spoken. A new staff intern from Canada whispered, "It's like he's passing the torch." Jason, standing silently behind the wooden fence, said nothing. But his eyes softened, and he bowed his head, just slightly, a bow for resilience, for grace, for the being who turned wounds into light. Time continued its quiet march, but the center maintained its gentle rhythm, steady as Duke's breath, low, warm, and full of trust. Children came to visit and learn. Police units sent dogs for recovery. Wordless therapy sessions continued each day. And in every yard, every quiet room, one could feel the footprints of a dog who had passed through it all to become a guiding light. In the small office at the end of the hallway, where portraits of the center's pioneer dogs were framed, the largest photo was still of Duke. Lying on the grass, eyes gazing up at a puppy, mouth slightly curved in one of his rare smiles. A moment where an old wound had become a bridge between generations. At conferences, Elena often ended her talks with a note, "We never taught Duke anything. He taught us that no wound is meaningless if seen at the right time, and no darkness is eternal when there's a gaze willing to wait." That night, with the lights off, and the wind of autumn slipping gently through the windows, Duke lay quietly on his old rug near the door to the yard. Outside, Bram was sleeping peacefully, for the first time in the dark without curling into himself. Jason sat beside Duke, his hand softly stroking the back now softened with age. "Rest, old friend," he whispered. "You've done more than any being ever could." Duke didn't answer. Just one deep, slow breath, an affirmation from the heart. And in the faint glow of the last hallway light, one could see something never printed on any signboard, but understood by all. This place wasn't built from bricks or budgets. It began with a creature who seemed to have lost everything, but chose instead to give trust, a torch lit in the dark, and one that will never go out. From a forgotten wound in a corner of shadow, Duke became a symbol of healing, of patience, and of a light that never dims. His journey not only brought life back to broken beings, but ignited a movement that changed how the world sees animals, not as tools of service, but as souls worthy of love and protection. Have you ever seen a dog overcome trauma to help others? Share your story in the comments, because maybe, just maybe, your memory will become someone else's hope. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like the video, share it with fellow animal lovers, and subscribe to the channel so we can keep spreading kindness, where light begins in the very eyes once lost in the dark.